Once you've completed all of those sketches, we now want to work on the process of vectoring them and bringing them into the computer. The first step will be to either photograph or scan your sketches. A scanner is really ideal for this, but a lot of us don't have one. We do have one in our lab that you're welcome to go on campus and use. But if that's not possible for a variety of reasons, you're welcome to go ahead and photograph the sketches. If you're photographing the sketches, it's really important that you shoot them in good lighting. We want to get a really great shot of these sketches. You don't want shadows over them. It'll make it more difficult. It's okay if there's shadows around the sketches, but not on the sketches themselves. You're also going to want to shoot them completely from a top aerial angle. So you really want to make sure you're holding the camera parallel to the paper and directly above the sketches so that you get that top-down view. We really don't want to have an angle involved as we're tracing over these sketches as well. That'll make it really hard in Illustrator. This is another part that you'll want to spend some time on to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. So you have a really great photograph or scan, ideally, that you can work on in Illustrator with the pen tool and the shape tools. If you have a sketch that's on an angle, it's going to be really hard to draw that because you're going to be compensating from the angle that was created if you weren't holding the camera directly above that sketch. So those are some pointers on taking the photo, or again, ideally scanning those sketches, and then you'll want to get those on the computer. Now remember that you may only be working with one or two sketches that were selected and you agreed upon after getting feedback to pursue in Illustrator, but you're going to need photographs of all of them. You're going to need all of those to go into the final template to show that process. So you may as well photograph all 8 of them and get them on your computer so that it'll be an easier process as you work to put that final InDesign template together that again needs to show all of that process along the way. So I have Adobe Illustrator open. I just created a letter-sized file. You can really create any size you want. You will not be turning in this file. It's just a place for you to work on creating these vectors that we will then copy and paste into that InDesign template. You do want to save this though. You're going to want to have access to it. So you want to make sure that the file is neat and orderly, and also that we save it so that we don't lose the file. So that's the first step. Is I'm going to go ahead and save this file. Want an Illustrator file, that's great. Now I can just go ahead and do that Command S and save as I go along, because this is going to be a little bit complicated. It's going to take a little bit of time and we don't want to lose that work and have to redo it. So now we want to bring the sketches into Illustrator. So you could always go to File, Place to place that image or images, but I'm going to go ahead and click and drag and just drop them in here. So these are some sketches that I did in grad school of bees. They're pretty close to what we were doing on this assignment. Some of them are a little bit too line-based, I would say. But this was for a specific scenario that I was working on. But I will show you why these do work. I'm not just going to create these out of thin lines. I'm going to use shapes, which is what you want to do in this case. This is also one where I used the concept of substitution. So here I've worked with substituting the wings for an infinity symbol. So those wings sort of read as an infinity symbol and a wing, which was related to the project itself. I also brought in a lot of sketches here, which you may not want to do, that's fine, but these are all just clumped together already. These also went through that process we did. They're a bitmap TIFF. So that's why they look a little bit different than maybe how your sketches will look. And that's not a phase I'd recommend going through. This was just a part of the project that I was working on. Another thing I'll point out is that some of these might be better. I'm going to go ahead and render this one. This was the final one that I did. But you know, something that's more shape-based like this and more heavy, or this one might work better here. Working on this. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get the sketches in a way where I don't move them around on accident. I just want to be able to look at them and use them as a reference point. So you could always lock these. You could go to Object and you could do lock selection. So that's one way to do it, but I'm actually going to do it a little differently. I'm going to put on a different layer. So I'm going to come to layers and I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to move that underneath that layer because I want it on the bottom. I'm going to make sure I have this selected and go to Edit, Cut. I'm going to come to this layer and I'm going to do Edit, Paste in Front. So now I have that there. Then I can lock this layer, which is really great. And as long as I have layer 1 selected, I'll be working on the layer on top of it and I can draw on top of these sketches. You can even do this if you double click right here on layer 2. You can even do this template layer, which is actually set up for exactly what we're doing. And you'll notice that it'll dim the sketch as well, which sometimes can be useful. So I'm going to go ahead and use it like that. I need to make sure that I'm on layer 1 when I start working on this. So I'm going to zoom in to the sketch that I want to build. So there's a lot of ways to approach this. I'm going to show some different ways which might work for different scenarios of what you've drawn and what you might be working to render in Illustrator. But at the core of this, it's really about the pen tool. The pen tool is a really powerful tool in Illustrator that you want to work to master. It's how we draw in the computer, and it's how we create vector art that is professional quality. There are some tricks to the pen tool. It can have a little bit of a steep learning curve at first, but stick with me here and follow along, and I think you'll start understanding how the pen tool works. So the pen tool is over here. You can always get to it if you press P. If you ever just press P, it'll automatically go to that tool. And this works with what's called Bezier curves. That's the system that the pen tool works on, and it's about plotting points and then pulling these handles that determine how the curves appear on your screen. But one of the first things you need to really understand about the pen tool is that where you place the points is really important. I think a lot of people approach this arbitrarily and just start putting points in. Sometimes they even make a lot of points. They sort of do what I'm doing here. But one thing that's not good about this is not only is it not best practices, but it will create more of a jagged edge. If I zoom in here and I make this filled, you'll see that there's kind of a jagged edge to this, and we don't want that. We want nice, smooth curves. The other thing about working with the pen tool is the fewer points you have, the better. You really want to work with as few points as possible. That's going to be the most professional, and it's also going to make it look the smoothest. It's hard to explain, but sometimes when there's extra points, it'll create this illusion of a little blip on the edge of a shape, and it just doesn't look right. So fewest points possible. But again, plotting those points are important. So I'll show you a little bit of how to plot points. We use what's called the extrema. It's where we find the very far edge on a shape. So I'm going to start with this sort of half shape of the head, this sort of half circle shape that I have. And I want to come in and first turn on the rulers. So that's Command R. It's also under the view menu if you want to find it there. And this will allow me to pull some guides. So I want to pull guides to all the edges of this shape. So I'm going to pull one down here to where the top is. Then I'll pull one over here to the left side, the very edge of that left side. And then I'll pull one over here to the very edge of the right side. So I'm kind of guessing a little bit, getting things where I want them. I'll put one at the bottom as well, but this one won't be as useful because of the way that these bottom strokes are angled, but it will also help me make sure that I get these even. I think in the end, I want this to be completely symmetrical, and so I'll show another technique after this using the reflect and also the mirror technique, which might be helpful to you. But first I want to go through the pen tool. I also want some point placement help on the interior as well. So I'm going to put some more lines, one here and here and then here. So if that makes sense, that's really the extrema of the white shape that's in the interior. And that's really going to set me up for success here and help me understand where points need to be plotted. If you're really comfortable with the pen tool or if you use it a lot, you don't always need to pull these guides. But when you're starting out, I think it's a great way to help you find that extrema. Another thing to understand about this is it's okay to build things in multiple pieces. It's actually very common in design. Obviously in this one, I'm gonna have to because there are separate pieces that are sort of close together and using Gestalt to combine. But it's very normal to do that. I'm just gonna focus on this shape here. And then I'll probably do the antennas as separate shapes. Also, my drawing isn't perfect and I don't like how the antennas are not symmetrical. So it's another place where I'll probably draw one and then use the reflect tool to build the other. Now that we have these guides for myself, it'll help me know where to plot points so I'm ready to get started. I'm gonna go back to that pen tool and I know one place I wanna put a point is up here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click and I'm gonna hold. And when I do that, it builds a point. You'll see this hollow box there, white filled box, but then there's also these handles. And the handles we want to pull in the direction that we want the line to go in. So typically the pen tool will start always going to the right. So I wanna make sure I pull this to the right. Another trick with the pen tool is generally it's best practice to only have horizontal or vertical handles. That'll really help you also make really high quality pen tool work. So I'm holding down Shift, which is not allowing me to put this handle anywhere I want. It's really helping me keep it horizontal. If you're ever really struggling to make a shape with horizontal or vertical handles, you can obviously make other ones. Sometimes it's necessary, but generally just keep that in mind that when possible, you really want to stick to those two. I'm just going to pull the handles to about here. It's a very arbitrary decision right now, because remember, one of the beautiful things about working in the computer and one of the most amazing things about working with a pen tool is we can fix things. I'm really going to rough things out here. I'm really just going to get things generally where they are, and then I can go back and improve what I've done. So I'm still holding down Shift, still have my mouse selected or clicked down, and I'm going to go ahead and let go. And now I have a line. And you'll notice that this line behaves a little funny. It's always moving to the right. Like if I move it too far this way, it's having a hard time going that direction because this handle is telling it wants to go to the right. So now I'm going to come over here to the next point that I want to plot, which is about here. I'm going to do it a little bit lower, maybe about there. And I'm going to click and hold. I'm holding down Shift so that I can draw that curve of the top part of the bee's head. All right, now I'm going to come down here and I want to put a point right about here. But look what happened. I'm not able to really make the line go in the direction that I want. It's sort of going too far to the right down there at the bottom. But that's okay. I'll fix that later. It's because that handle I pulled isn't quite right, but I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But now I get to an area where I want to have more of a 90-degree angle. This is going to be a little bit of a different process because I actually want the points to go, because I actually want the handles to go in different directions. So I'm going to click and hold. And what I'm first going to worry about is the handle on the right, the one that's going up into the right, which is addressing the previous part of the path that I made. And I'm going to get it right about there. I'm not going to pull it too far for now, but I just want to make sure it's following the curve of the sketch. So I still have the mouse selected, and I'm going to hold down the Option key. And what's going to happen is it's going to give me the ability to move the other handle independently from the one before it. Very, very useful for making these kinds of corners. And I'm just going to create a little bit of a handle following the direction of the sketch, or generally the way that I think it needs to go. And then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to create another point. And again, this is another place where I need to use that Option trick. So I'm going to click and hold, and I'll pull this handle back, and then I'll hold down Option and move this one to follow the curve of the sketch. You'll notice these are some places too where I'm breaking my own rule. I have handles that aren't vertical or horizontal, and these are places where I can't make these shapes without having handles that aren't vertical or horizontal. So remember, that's not a rule you absolutely have to follow. It's just when possible, try to make sure those handles are vertical or horizontal. Then I'm going to come up here and I'm actually going to try to make these points line up more or less. I think that'll be a nice symmetrical thing to do in this. So I'll click and hold here, pulling that down to follow the sketch as best I can. Then I'm going to put one up here. Maybe I'll try to get it directly below that one. Again, click and hold, drag that across. I need one right here. I might try to get it to be horizontally aligned with these as well. I'm just going to eyeball it for now. We can fix it later. All right, pull that handle. And then I have one here. Again, I'm going to do that little Option trick. So I'm going to move that and then hold down Option to get it going the other direction. Another one over here. Same deal, holding down Option to move independently that other handle. Then I'll put one here kind of lined up with that point to the right. Again, I'll do another completely vertical handle pull because that really makes sense here. And then I'm going to go back to the beginning. You'll notice when I hover over the first point I started with, there's a little circle now next to the pen tool. And that's a way that we close the path. So we're actually going to close this path, but I'm going to click and hold so that I can pull that first handle to get it where I want it to be. All right, that looks pretty good. So one thing you're going to say right off the bat is, why can't I see it? Well, if you look over here, I have no fill and no stroke. So I want to change the fill to have a black fill. But in this case, I'm actually going to make it a different color. I think it'll be easier to see. So I'm going to go with a really bright color. How about yellow? It seems appropriate for a bee. And so I'm getting there, right? It's not quite right, but now I can go back and I can do some cleanup. Roughing it out is good. It's fine to start off in this way, and we're going to iterate and keep moving. And remember that part of this is you need to provide multiple vector sketches. So one of it might be that you go and you rough this entire thing out and you start cleaning it up. And then maybe you go ahead and you select the whole thing, pretend I roughed it all out, and you use an Option and you move it over. so that you have the one from before and you keep refining it. That's very common work that designers do in Illustrator when we're vectoring things. We save lots of versions so we can always go back. So don't hesitate to do that. But let's look at some ways that we could fix this. So one thing we want to talk about is the direct selection tool. It's right here, and what that's going to allow us to do is actually select individual points, which is what we want to go to next. We want to be able to manipulate these points individually. I'm also going to go ahead and press Command semicolon to turn off those guides. I don't really want those right now. I can turn them on again later if I do. So I think one thing I want to do is maybe line up these points. So I tried to do that, right? I tried to eyeball it, but I know I didn't get it quite right. So if I click and drag, I can select these 2 points, and you'll see that the other ones are still white. They're still hollow, which means they're not selected. You can also click on one and then hold down Shift and select another one, however you want to do it. One thing that's really useful is you can actually use the align functions on points. So what I'm going to do is do this horizontal align center, which will get those points directly on top of each other. Then I'm going to select these 2, and I'm going to go ahead and click here so those are centered, and I'll click here and make sure those are centered as well. And then just for safe measure, I might select all of these. Maybe I want all 4 of these across to be all center aligned. Because now I'm setting myself up. I'm making sure, again, those points are symmetrical, they're in the right places, so they're really going to work. Then what I can do is if I ever select a point, I can move it. Maybe I'm like, oh, I think this point needs to come down a little bit. Remember, if you hold down Shift, it will restrict where things move if you only want to move it horizontal or vertical. But if you don't hold down Shift, you can really move it anywhere you want. But sometimes that can be handy. Maybe you don't feel like you got the point exactly where you needed it. Like one thing I'm seeing here is if you look at the distance between these 2 points, it's much greater than these 2. And I think I want to get that a little bit wider on this side. You can also move the handles. So if you click on just one of these points, you can move the handles. But one thing that can be frustrating is you can only move one side, which sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes you only want to move one side of the handle, but sometimes you kind of want to pull the handle again. Sometimes you really want to kind of start over. You don't want to move the point, but you want to start over with pulling the handle. Well, if you click under the pen tool, there's other tools here. And one of them is this anchor point tool. And that's really handy because if you click on a point, it'll remove the handles. Then I can pull those handles again. Or you can just click and hold, and that will allow you to also pull those handles. So that's really handy. I use this a lot when sometimes I don't really like the way the handles are pulled. Sometimes it's hard to see what's going to happen with those handles in the middle of a drawing. So it's nice to be able to change that. Another thing as I pull these handles is I'm seeing that this handle is really not correct. I pulled it way too far. That's what's creating this little blip right here. So I want to come in and pull this handle back. And I think I want to pull it back here as well. I mean, in some ways it might be ideal if these handles were identical, right? That would be pulling the curve in the same way. So it's sometimes a little hard to do, but I'm just going to pull this down and eyeball it so I get it a little bit closer to being similar. So that's not quite right. Let me do a little bit more. And you're seeing that it's starting to clean up. It's starting to be a more cohesive sketch. It's starting to have more symmetry and be a little bit more professionally drawn. I also want this interior one to be more similar, and I think this one's more correct. So I'm going to go in here and pull this one again. I'm going to go ahead and use the anchor tool. It's also a good shortcut to know to get to this tool. It's Shift C. So I use that a lot. I go between the P for pen tool and then Shift C. So Shift C will bring that anchor point. I'm going to go ahead and just re-pull this. I want to make sure I pull it in the right direction. That looks better. I'm going to go back to the direct selection, which you can go to with just the Command A if you just press A. That looks pretty good. I'm getting closer. Another thing that might be helpful is sometimes you want to add or remove points. So you'll see these 2 tools here, which you might have already realized that's what they do. So if for some reason I want to add a point anywhere on this, I can use this tool to add a point. Maybe for some reason you realize that you really need another point somewhere to really make the shape that you want. Remember, you want as few points as possible, but sometimes we make mistakes or we realize that we could do something better. So if I have this highlighted and I go to the plus pen, I can go anywhere on here and it will add a point. And what's really cool is it will add the point with the handles that keep the path going in the direction that I want. So that's really handy. And then you can always adjust that point or adjust those handles. Similar to the plus pen tool, there's also the minus. There's the subtract or delete anchor point. So I can come in here and I could delete this because I don't really need it in this case. And what's unfortunate here, since I deleted it, the handles aren't going to quite go back to the way they were, right? So in this case, I think an undo makes more sense. But another interesting trick that you can do is if you hold down shift when you do the minus, it will actually keep things where they are. It's a little trick that's really handy to know. So if you ever have that problem, just by pressing shift, it will go back or keep the handles around that point where they need to be to keep the shape how it looks. You can also delete points, but I want to show quickly why that cannot be a good idea. If I go back to the direct selection tool and I select just one point and I press delete, it actually breaks the path. It's a different process than using the minus. If you notice, if I come down here, I can now pick up where I left off. See how on the right there's a little slash line? That says, okay, let's pick up the path again. And now I'm back to where I was of creating points, and then I can come back here and reconnect it. And sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes that's valuable, but for the most part, I avoid deleting points. You always want to subtract points. It's gonna be better when you're refining and trying to improve something, unless you really wanna break something apart and start over. I'll show one more tool that can be useful. Sometimes you wanna break things apart. Sometimes you've built something and you like one part of it, but you don't really like the other part. So what's interesting about this is there's a tool called the Scissor Tool, which lives in Illustrator. And what's really useful about that Scissor Tool is it will allow you to cut a vector up in a certain place where you want to. So if I come under the eraser, you'll find that Scissor Tool. It's also C, which can be handy to know. And then you'll see that if I come anywhere on this, it'll add a point where I cut it. But what's interesting is it's not really a point, it's 2 points. It's now something that I can break apart. So I can break something in a certain place. But what I like even more, I do sometimes use the Scissor Tool, but what I find even more useful is if I select one point, so I have just one selected, and look up here, there's a Scissor Tool, and what that's gonna do is it's gonna cut it exactly at that anchor point. And I'm not gonna say always, but a lot of the time, that's what I wanna do. So I'm gonna go ahead and click cut right there. Then I'm gonna select the other one and I'm gonna cut it as well using the Scissor Tool. And what's gonna happen now is I'm gonna have 2 pieces, which is gonna be really helpful because now I wanna flip to maybe another way to have done this, which would have involved using the reflect tool. Since I want this to be symmetrical, it makes sense to maybe only draw half of it and then let the computer help me draw the other half and keep it identical. So that's where the Scissor Tool can be useful in this case. I'm gonna go ahead and delete the other half since I'm gonna go ahead and reflect it. The good thing is since I had those points right where I wanted them, pretty much halfway on this head, I think it's gonna work out really well. But remember now, this isn't a solid shape anymore. They're not connected. So you don't have to, but I think I'm gonna go ahead just for good measure and complete this so it's one shape again. So now I have one shape and I can work on refining this shape and then I can work on reflecting it. So I'm gonna do a couple more things to this just to improve it. I don't like down here how these are a right angle. So you could always use this trick, right? We've seen this before in Illustrator, how there's these corner pieces. And sometimes that can be really useful. You're welcome to use them and it'll help you really create better curves. It also does it correctly where it creates 2 points on the outer edges that create that nice smooth curve on the inside. So that can be great and I have no problem with that. It also did it here though. So that's one thing to be careful of, is that it's sometimes hard to make it do it in just one place. So again, that sometimes can be really frustrating. So another way to do this is to simulate what the computer is doing. I'm actually gonna go in with the plus. I'm gonna zoom in a lot closer and I'm gonna put a point right about there and another one right about there. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to the minus and I'm gonna delete this point. And this time I'm gonna delete it, I think without holding the shift key, because that's gonna help me get what I want. And then I'm gonna go in with that anchor point tool so I can pull these handles very carefully. I wanna keep this in one line, both handles, to create a little bit of a curved edge. And I don't want something too curved, so I'm gonna be really careful how I do this. But I think that looks pretty good. And then I'll do the same thing over here as well. So I'm gonna add points on either side. I don't like where I put that one. I'm gonna undo it, put it more like right about there. I kind of want them to be equidistant. And then I'll use the minus to subtract. And then I'll play with pulling these points using the anchor tool. So that'll really help. So now I have some nice rounding there, which I think is a nice touch. I think that looks better. I think it's more how I intended or I envisioned this to look. Another thing that can be helpful sometimes is to play with the opacity. I can also turn the opacity down on this, which sometimes will allow me to see underneath. Sometimes you really want to see the sketch underneath, which can be useful. And in this case, I feel that this handle isn't quite right. I think I want to move this in a tiny bit because I don't like how thick this outer area is. But other than that, I think I'm pretty close. I mean, I might finesse this even more if this was my project, but for the sake of the demo, I think that's looking pretty good. So now what I can do is reflect it and create the other side. So I'm going to select this, and then I'm going to go to Object, Transform, Reflect. And there we go. It's going to actually reflect it. You can reflect horizontally or vertical. If you have preview selected, you can see that. And then I'm going to click Copy because I want another one. So now I have it, and I'm going to move it over until I get it about where I want it to be. You can layer them on top of each other, or you can have a little bit of a gap. It's really up to you. If you have a gap, what you'll need to do is come in and break these up. So you'll need to select these and use the scissor tool. So I'm going to go in and scissor all of these apart. So now these are more or less broken apart. So now what I need to do is get in here and look at what's going on so I can join these two together and these two together. So I'll click in here and I'll look at what's happening. If I move this, okay, that looks right. I'm undoing and I'll move that as well. Something's off there. It looks like when it cut apart, it built a second piece. So there we go. That's what I want. I'm going to move these just carefully to make sure. Okay, nothing's connected. So then I'm going to select this point, and I'll go up to Object, Path, Join, which can be really handy. This is going to really help me. I'm going to also go here and do Object, Path, Join. Now that's all one shape. So I was able to reflect that, get it all together. Now it moves as one piece. We do have extra points though, so if we're really pushing here, we want to fix that. So I'm going to go ahead and bring a ruler in the middle, and I'm going to add some points. So I need to turn on those guides again. I'm going to go to the plus. I'm going to add a point on here right there and right there. So then what I want to do is delete these so that I can pull the curve from just one point. So you can delete them like this, but remember that shift delete can be a little bit better. It's not going to be perfect in this case, but it's going to work. And then I can go to the anchor tool and I can slightly pull those handles again so that I get the curve that I want. So something like that, and then something like that. So I know this is really complicated. I know there's a lot we're throwing at you, but it's important that you understand this. It's really vital to doing great graphic design work. And look how far we've gotten. I know I've only drawn one part, but this is looking really polished. It's looking really good. There might be some more adjustments I would make, but I'm going to continue on this demo just so we can keep moving forward and showing you other techniques in Illustrator. So there is another way to work in Illustrator and create things, because sometimes what you want to do is just work with simple shapes. Maybe the way you've drawn, abstracted, and stylized something is fairly simple. Maybe that's really what we're after, and we could do it by just using the shape tools. So don't ignore these tools as well. There are times where you're going to have to use the pen tool, but the shape tools are still really valuable too. So we can always, draw squares, you can draw circles. The other thing we can do is use the Pathfinder tools. Those are really powerful tools inside of Illustrator that allow us to more visually create shapes. So this can be kind of fun. I'm going to go ahead and have this circle, and let's say we wanted to make like a crescent shape, which might be a little bit hard to draw with the pen tool. It's really not that hard, but I'll show you this just as an example. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this shape, and then I want to make it white, because this is one of those tools where what you see is what you get. So if that's the shape I want, this is where I want things to live. I want the white shape to be here on top of this yellow-green shape. But maybe that's not quite what I want. Maybe I want more of a crescent. Maybe I want something like this. So I could do that. And once you have things where you want, you can go into the Pathfinder tools. So those live in the window. I'm going to go down to Pathfinder. And there's a lot of options here. Some of them are going to do different things. Sometimes you want to play with them to kind of see what happens. But the ones that you'll use the most are the Unite and the minus front. Unite is going to combine two shapes together, the minus front is going to remove something. So in this case, I'm going to use the minus front. So I'm on the selection tool. I'm going to select both of these and do the minus front. And you'll notice what happens is now I just have that one shape. I just have the shape that was there with that white part removed. In addition, you can also unite things together. So I'm going to undo way back and show another way that I could have done this head. So if I undo all the way back to where this was two pieces, so right after I reflected it, there we go, I'll move it over. If these two actually laid on top of each other, so if I actually move it to where they're on top of each other, I could use the unite to actually combine these together. So again, I've selected both, I do unite, and boom, they become one shape. But one thing to be wary of with this is sometimes it creates some ugliness. Like, look what happened there. That's not quite right. There's going to be some cleanup involved on this. So I need to zoom in, get on that one area, and delete some points. So there's quite a few points that I need to delete to make this have a much smoother look. So it's kind of depends on what you want to do, depending on how much you want to adjust these things. But now I'm going to have to pull handles again to get that curve. But that's another way that the Pathfinder tools can be useful. So those are the ways that you can work with shapes as well. You might play with some of these other Pathfinder options, but to be honest, for the most part, I only really use the unite and minus front. I'm not saying the others aren't useful, but I think for this assignment, those are the ones that you're going to be playing with the most. Now I want to show one other thing of how we could have built this head. It's just, I want to make sure I'm showing you different tools so that you have a lot of ways that you can create things and assess the easiest way to build what you're trying to build. So I'm now going to undo again all the way back to when this was two pieces, and I want to go back to when there was just one. Then I want to turn on the guides again so I can kind of see what I'm looking at, and I might even pull a guide right in the middle, like right where I think the middle of this head is. So now I have that half line. Then I can come up to Object, Repeat, Mirror. And this is kind of a weird tool. It's a new tool in Illustrator, but you'll notice that it immediately mirrors that, very similar to what happened when I did the reflect. But now I have a lot more control. One thing is these nodes at the top and the bottom will rotate. So I don't really want that here, but you can rotate where that happens. And the middle one will actually determine how much they overlap. It's kind of interesting. The thing that I think is most powerful about this tool is if you're building something even more complex than this. Sometimes you have something that's really complicated that you want to make symmetrical, and it doesn't mean you couldn't use the reflect tool, but maybe it's something that you want to keep editing. I think that's where the value is of this tool. Because what's going to happen is I can click outside of this, I can close this off, so you'll see I'm in that mirror repeat. So if I click this arrow, or if I click outside, double click anywhere, you'll notice that I'm back to having that one piece. But that mirror consistently is on there. It's going to be something that's always associated with this vector now. But the interesting thing that I think makes this powerful and why you might use it is if I double click on this and I open this up again, not only do I have this power now, I still can go back and change that. But what's really interesting is I can select the points. If I double click, I can get back into the vector itself. You want to be careful to get into it at this phase. And then if I go to the direct selection, so I can see both of them, I can select one of these points and I can move it, and it will move it on both sides. So it's going to keep that mirroring, which is kind of interesting. Depending on what you're doing, this could be really useful. One thing to be careful of though is if you keep clicking and you just have one side selected, it will actually allow you to just modify one side instead of both. So again, you have to click into where you can see both of them. I'll do it again quickly. If I double click, I want to make sure that I actually am not so far into this where I just have one selected, right? I want to make sure that I have both selected. So if I get in there, I can do that, which can be useful. Again, if you're doing something really complicated, this mirroring technique can be useful. Although I find that the reflect tool will suit most of my needs. The last thing I want to show is one last tool which could be useful. Here I think it's going to be really useful on these wings. So I talked about that you don't want to use stroke. We want to avoid that. That's not a good way to build things. We don't want to use the pen tool or the line tool and just create things like this, right? That are just line based. This is not appropriate. It's weak. It's not going to create a professional outcome. But there are ways to work with stroke to make them have variance in thickness, which can be useful sometimes. And for these wings, I think it maybe isn't the best way to do this, but I think it could be a good strategy to try. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that pen tool and I'm going to start drawing points. But this time I'm going to go through the middle. I'm not going to actually go through and do the edges because I'm going to do this a little bit differently. So I'm going to draw this through. I'm going to try to do it quickly. I think I'm going to need one in the middle here. And another one here. So again, I'm going through the middle of this shape this time. And then one last one here. This handle got pulled a little far, so I'm going to go back to the anchor tool, clean that up. I more or less want to make sure things are going through the middle of the shape. So let's end it there. That looks pretty good. Maybe this one isn't quite far enough out. Again, you could also reflect this. I could do a reflect and create the path to make it perfectly symmetrical on either side. But what I want to show is this width tool. The width tool is really interesting and that it will allow you to go into a certain place on a path and actually expand that area. So you'll notice when I hover over, this little white line is created. And then I can click and drag and I can determine the width of the path in that particular area. And then you'll notice that it will taper the rest of it out based on where the other width values are. And it will always default to having width values at the endpoints. Sometimes it'll create ones in other places. So just be wary of that. But that's one way to do it. But my favorite way to do it actually is to zoom in a little bit further again. And I can actually determine mathematically what I want the width to be. So if I hover over a certain place and I double click, I get this menu. And this is an edit. And this is really handy because this will help you do things mathematically. So you can change the total width. You can put in a value of what you want it to be. You can also go in and control the width on just one side. Maybe for some reason on one side, you want it to be wider than the other. So again, a lot of functionality here. It's really useful. For this, I'm going to go ahead and keep them the same. If I click this, it'll keep the proportions, but I need to change these back to being the same proportion first. I'm going to do 1.5 on either side. Now I could select this if I want to, but I don't think it really matters. So let's go with that. And then what I can do is I can go around to other places and change it. Like here, I think this is too wide. I don't want it that wide in this end point. I want it to taper a little bit more to a point. So I'm going to come in here and double click on this one, and then I'm going to reset this value. Maybe I just want it to go to a 0.5 or maybe even a 0.25 in this case. That way that'll really taper and it'll look more like what my sketch is like. There's also a width point here somewhere that I don't really like. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this one. I don't really want that one there. And the other advantage is I can come over and I can mimic this on the other side. So if I double click on this one, I can change this to be the same as it was on the other side, which will make it more symmetrical. So I can double check what this one was. It's 3 point, perfect. So this one's now 3 point as well. Then I can come and double click on this one and I can say 0.25. So this is one way you can work with line. This is one way that I think is acceptable where you can work with line because you're really making it more shape-based. You're really allowing it to taper and be more interesting and more focused on shape rather than line. So that's another tool that might be helpful to you. So that's really all I'm going to show you. I know that was a lot. You may want to go back and watch portions of this video to help you, but I really wanted to arm you with some really good pen tool knowledge, some really good understanding of how Illustrator works, because I know for a lot of you, this is the first time that you're actually doing something in vector at this level in Adobe Illustrator, and it's important that you know the correct way to do these things. So I give you a lot of ideas of how to approach it. You might want to bring the sketches in and think a little bit about what tools might work best for your particular scenario, but I hope that helps you get started to creating those vectors. If you're ever struggling and you want more information, you can always write your instructor. There are also lots of YouTube videos about this process that go over using the pen tool or creating logos. Those might be helpful for you to use as well. Just remember that our syllabus outlines, though, that you cannot follow a tutorial exactly and turn in the work out of that tutorial. So if you happen to find a tutorial that goes over how to draw B, you can't follow that exactly and turn in that work. We consider that plagiarism. We're all about using those videos, but then use that information and create something new on your own. Adjust the final outcome in a way that works for you. So best of luck to you. I know this can be a little bit difficult at first, but we know you can do it, and it's great to learn how to do this in Adobe Illustrator correctly.